Hello to all of you watching us from wherever you are around the world, and welcome to Renault E-Ways, a unique event dedicated to electric mobility of today and tomorrow. An event that brings together men and women who are taking tangible actions to meet the challenges towards zero emissions. We're coming to you from Hangar Y, which is an industrial building in Meudon, just near Paris, and connected with us via the wonders of technology, Ed Gillespie. Ed, can you hear me? How are you doing?
I'm very good, Louise, from a wet and grey London.
Wonderful. It's sunny here. We've got nice weather today. So you are the future guy. You co-founded Futurenaut, an agency that specializes in sustainability communications and change, from what I can gather. The title of our discussion today is Rethink Mobilities, and that's exactly what we're going to do together, if you're okay with that. Tell us what your vision of today's mobility is and what challenges we're going to have to face to make mobility possible in a potential +2-degree world, Ed.
Yeah, so I think the key challenge, Louise, is actually understanding what we mean by mobility, because actually that's what people want. They want the why of being able to get around, the purpose of mobility itself. And I think we're going to see a lot of disruption and innovation around the what, about how we actually deliver that mobility, because we've been through an era of hyper-mobility, if you like, where everyone wants to be able to travel wherever they want, whenever they want, however often they want. And that's got consequences, that's got externalities. And I think one of the big challenges for a 2-degree world is to try and internalize some of those externalities. And the classic example of that, obviously in cities, and I've just driven across London, it's taken me 90 minutes to do 12 miles. You know, the cliche is that it's slower than the horse and cart was 100 years ago. And even if we electrify all of our vehicles, we'll still be sat in clean, quiet traffic jams. So I think we've got to understand that the externalization of mobilities has to change, and we have to try and incorporate some of those impacts. And I think for a 2-degree world, we have to be very concerned about the rising heat, you know, and extreme weather events, you know, literally the tarmac melting on the streets in some cities in India, for example, and actually just it being too uncomfortable and too hot to travel. Plus, we'll have more extreme weather events, increased flooding. There's a lot of water on the roads today in London from some of the intense rainstorms. But also, I think we're already starting to see a trend towards relocalization, people focusing a bit more on their immediate neighborhoods. And obviously, lockdown has put that into a really sort of stark perspective, because we're actually obviously living very, very locally. And finally, you know, we have this other challenge around last mile delivery. In London, the congestion charge has largely removed individual private vehicles from the streets of the centre of the city. But the streets are still clogged because we've got all the delivery vans, we've got the Ubers, we've got all these other vehicles which have just sort of taken up the slack. So it feels like we don't actually make much progress. We seem to be sort of stuck in this, you know, virtual gridlock, which has been happening now for decades.
There's a big issue at the moment. Obviously, you touched on it, lockdown, of course, and this pandemic that's touched the world. It's a huge crisis that we're going through. How is this crisis actually affecting mobility, Ed?
Well, you can't avoid the virus, can you? As I said, no. I think lockdown has dramatically affected our ability to move around. I mean, in some ways, I think what it's done is massively accelerated existing trends. So you probably already had a movement towards pedestrianisation and a degree of reclamation of road space back from the private car. And I think with the need to extend pavements for physical distancing and to reclaim more space for bars and restaurants to have outdoor seating, I think we've just seen that take a step change. But also the commuting, you know, in some ways, our commute was madness. London was 9 million journeys made by public transport a day. And I just don't think we're going to go back to that. I think this is in some way a reset. We will get a return to some commuting, but I don't think it'll be anything like the scale or intensity because of the incredible inefficiency that's been exposed by us stopping doing it. You know, just in terms of the time, the stress, sure. And obviously the spread of contagion which being crammed into a tube carriage can obviously bring. And equally, our big tower blocks, our big buildings, when you've got an express lift, which usually takes 20 people up 30 floors, and you can only get 2 people in it because of physical distancing, it's going to take you a lot longer to get your workforce in and out of the building, even if you stagger their hours and even if you only have a fraction of people coming in. So I think there's a lot of these sort of unexpected impacts which have come from the lockdown and from the pandemic. And I think we need to see this as a reset opportunity to genuinely reimagine and re-envision how our cities can function better. Because in some ways, by taking down the intensity of mobility in cities a peg or two, we might actually make them better places to live.
Of course, and then out of every crisis comes opportunity, that's for sure. That's what you're saying. I believe you're familiar with the 15-minute city. It's a concept in which daily urban necessities are within a 15-minute reach on foot or by bike. And in doing this, dwellers or inhabitants can reorganize their time to improve both living conditions and environmental conditions. Is this, for you, Ed, a realistic and efficient solution?
Well, I mean, why not? I mean, I think it was developed by Professor Carlos Moreno, who's obviously been advising the mayor of Paris on her kind of strategy in the kind of aftermath of the initial wave of the pandemic. And I think this notion that we can use our time much better, and it obviously extends from what I was just saying about the commute. And what Carlos Moreno was trying to say was actually we should be able to access all of the services we need, whether it's education, whether it's our workplace, whether it's food, whether it's restaurants and entertainment, ideally within 15 minutes walk or cycle ride, which would be roughly the amount of time we might spend waiting for public transport, and certainly a fraction of the time that we would otherwise expend on the journey. Now, people can criticize this and say that's completely unworkable in our zoned cities because people are currently too far spread out. But I think the wrong way to look at this is to think about it as a binary. Is it like either or? And I suspect, whilst we might not achieve the fully 15-minute city immediately or in the coming years, as I said, we won't go back to the full-on madness of the previous commute. And perhaps we'll look to a sort of hybrid approach where the constraint drives the imagination and we at least spend 2 or 3 days of our week perhaps much more locally, and then perhaps still going into the office 1 or 2 days a week. And that will have dramatic effects for the way money is spent in cities, for the viability and the conviviality, as the philosopher Ivan Illich used to say, of our immediate local neighborhoods. So again, I don't think it's a polarized choice. I think what we'll see is an increasing amount of that 15-minute city type of mentality with some of the commute that we had before.
Let's have a look forward. What's mobility going to look like in 2040, 2050, Ed?
Well, I mean, that is a massive question.
I know.
I mean, one thing it will not look like is it won't look like what we see in the adverts. I think we've been sold a false idea of urban mobility. I mean, no offense, by car companies for a very long time. And the practical experience is obviously very different to that. I mean, I call myself a futurist, but a sort of a reluctant futurist, because I don't tend to try and make predictions based on analysis of specific trends and just working out where they're going to go. I call my sort of brand of futurism a sort of stretching of the imagination of the possible, because if you predict, you tend to get things completely wrong. Famously, the banker who was advising Henry Ford's lawyer on whether to invest in the Ford Motor Company said, look, the automobile is just a novelty, a fad, the horse is here to stay. And clearly he got that completely wrong. So I think we're trying to work out, something which is almost impossible distance into the future by saying 20 or 30 years. What is important is to have a radical reimagination around what we can see as the foreseeable problems. In some sense, this pandemic was entirely foreseeable. I gave a talk at the Bank of England on non-linear climate risk in January this year. And we were looking at these low probability but very high impact type of challenges. And the 3 that were identified in that workshop were non-linear climate risk events, like I talked about extreme heat and flooding, pandemics and economic crises. And here we are currently facing all three. So I think the way that you have to change this is not through trying to extrapolate the trends and work out how you balance the different demand management of various different modes of transport, but to take a quite front foot, courageous approach and say, what we need here is genuine visionary leadership, which I think you're starting to see. I think some of the stuff that's happening in Paris now, but certainly the Dutch and the Danes in Amsterdam and Copenhagen have been doing this for some time and saying, you know, we're going to try and focus on genuinely walkable and cyclable cities with other modes integrating into that priority. And I think that's the right way round to have it.
Let's talk a little bit about the major trends and the issues that we're going to have to deal with in the coming years, Ed.
Yeah, so, I mean, obviously, this event that I'm a part of in terms of electrification is absolutely enormous. This is the big one, but it's not just about the electrification of the car, you know, it's electrification of the bus, and we already have electric railways, but I think you're also going to see a lot more electric bicycles and scooters,
sure.
and we can see some of those clogging up our streets, and the ones which are dockless, you know, abandoned on the pavement. So that's going to be a big management challenge. You know, how do we actually control the flow of these kind of spontaneous modes of transport or mobility that are coming onto our streets? I mean, and the second one is the role of electric vehicles, not even in mobility, but actually in the context of energy storage. Because when you have hundreds of thousands, if not millions of electric vehicles on the streets, they actually act potentially as a giant battery. So when we bring, and as we are bringing much more renewable energy onto the grid, we could actually be using those cars and those electric vehicles to store excess when it's windy and sunny, for example. So the wind turbines and the solar panels are putting lots of electricity onto the system, and then deploy it, you know, when you're getting less generation. And so the role of the car as a battery, or the electric vehicle as a battery, coordinated through new technology platforms, I think is really, really exciting. And some people describe, you know, the electric car as the 21st century coal truck, because once it's charged up, it's then movable, and then you can transport that energy to wherever it might be needed. And I think off the back of that, we then have the next phase, which is the driverless electric vehicle, which, you know, as is being trialed. We've got field trials, we've got experiments going on right now, and pilot studies going on all over the world. And I think we're yet to absorb the full implications of driverless electric vehicles, particularly economically, because the unit cost of a journey will come right down, and it will make almost no sense financially for families or households to own a car when the accessibility of an individual vehicle that they might hire through a driverless electric vehicle program will be so easy and so simple and so seamless. And that means huge savings for households. It means a potentially huge injection of cash into the economy, but also it means massive implications for the whole car manufacturing supply chain, because we'll need a lot fewer vehicles. I mean, the idling assets we have at the moment, I mean, less than half of London households own a car. But most cars, I mean, 90% of vehicles are idling or doing nothing 90% of the time. So you think about the amount of wealth which is tied up in what are effectively redundant assets right now, and you see what the potential for a driverless electric vehicles might then do to removing those idling assets and providing that service more affordably. It's really, really quite dramatic. And I think the point to note is that all this is likely to happen much faster than we are comfortable with. I think we're already seeing the sort of first edge of this disruption. And it's going to kind of take a huge chunk off the top of the profits of oil and gas companies, as the demand for oil and petrol in particular starts to go down. And I think that obviously also has financial sector implications. And finally, I think we also have to think about this from an intergenerational perspective. You know, I'm 48 years old. When I learned to drive when I was 17, the car was still that symbolic element of freedom and independence. You know, it was my connection to the world. And for generations now, the younger generations in particular, you know, it's the smartphone. That's what gives you your connectivity and your independence and your way into the world. And I think we're going to see a generation growing up who won't even bother learning to drive, partly because we have the driverless electric vehicles, but partly because they just won't need to because of the other elements of seamless mobility. And I think it's funny. Well, I think we'll probably look back and, driving in future will be perhaps like horse riding now. Not many people learn to ride a horse these days. Some still do. And I think driving might be like that in future.
You're part of the Greenpeace board, Ed. How might organizations such as Greenpeace work with car manufacturers to inspire positive change towards vehicle electrification?
Yeah, I mean, Greenpeace is a campaigning organization, so I have to be very clear. We don't really enter into partnerships with organizations. Car manufacturers would be an interesting one, odd bedfellows, and perhaps that's part of the nature of the beast these days. I sometimes say David has got to sort of learn to dance with Goliath, not just throw a slingshot stone at his forehead. But I think certainly we wouldn't be criticizing those organizations or those manufacturers that really seem to be embracing the future we need. And I think actually what it comes down to is this shared vision. It's not about just trying to defend the status quo. Those organizations and those businesses which genuinely grasp where the future is going are going to be the ones that have the campaigning organizations aligning alongside them. And I think that is this cultural reimagination, if you like, of both mobility and how cities work. And we've done it before, we just haven't done it for a very long time. We kind of need a Futurama for the 21st century.
And what does that mean, a Futurama for the 21st century?
Well, the original Futurama, and I'm not talking about the cartoon, I'm talking about the original New York World Fair exhibition in 1939, which was sponsored by General Motors. There was this hugely popular, very dynamic installation, which basically demonstrated, the future of superhighways and cars driving through cities and zone cities. And it was basically a sort of paean to the car and the brilliant world that the automobile was going to bring forth. And what we kind of need is a Futurama for 21st century mobility, which reflects some of the threads that I've been talking about here, because transport as a service, I think, is the next big phenomenon where we integrate all of the platforms together. So whether it's about using a train, a bus, perhaps a driverless electric vehicle or a taxi, a scooter, a bicycle, all of those can be booked through the same platform. So the notion of ownership becomes much less important because what you're buying into is effectively a Netflix of transportation, a transport as a service. And that can be really equitable and fair. I think we are going to have battles, as I said, over road space, particularly in historical cities. Not every city has beautiful Haussmann-designed boulevards like Paris. London is sort of stuck with a 17th and 18th century road network layout, which we sometimes have to kind of wrangle together. But I think the real thing here is the navigation of the transition. And there'll be some organizations and businesses which really grasp the mettle of what this shake-up means, and there'll be some that won't. And the American marketing guru Seth Godin talks about the brave or the dead. There's only two types of company, brave or dead. There are those who embrace the future that we must have, and there are those which will try and defend the status quo, and they will be the ones which go out of business. And I think, for me, it's going to be about the experience of the best of being an urban dweller. I mean, the reason that we aggregate and come together in cities is because of the benefits of dense living, dense cultural opportunities, the mixing of different peoples and cultures and traditions, and the dynamism and the excitement that urban living brings. And at the minute, that mobility, and certainly on our streets, is not reflecting that sort of dynamism. As I said, we're still crawling along at a snail's pace, and we need to bust out of our sort of reverie and have the courage to think radically, as they did at the original Futurama in 1939, because the journey should be the reward, and right now it isn't.
Ed, we're running out of time. Thank you so much for this passionate discussion together. It was really interesting to hear what you had to say on this subject, rethinking mobilities. Thanks so much, and we'll see you again very soon. And if you want to follow us, please find all our details on the Renault eWays website. Thanks again, Ed. Good to see you.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.